What began as little more than alcohol-soaked debauchery soon took a sinister turn.
So they started buying these motorcycles and forming little gangs, and then they could terrorize the countryside.
Motorcycle gangs fought to control territory, and the Chicago Outlaws led the charge. By the 1960s, the Outlaws had become larger and more organized than other Midwestern clubs. Making it clear they chose to live outside the rules of the normal world, they adopted a menacing logo, the Skull and Pistons, they nicknamed Charlie. With Charlie emblazed on their backs, the Outlaws grew bolder and their activities more deviant. In the 1960s, the Outlaws spread throughout the Midwest and moved eastward, merging with another motorcycle club in Florida to become the American Outlaws Association. But it was Vietnam that laid the foundation for what motorcycle gangs would become. The conflict brought an explosion in membership. Some disillusioned veterans saw an opportunity to belong and embrace the rebellious lifestyle on the fringes of society.
So folks come back from Vietnam. They need a place to go where they can be with people like them. Motorcycle clubs were one place where they could go. They didn't have to explain why they were the way they were. They could just be.
Perhaps more importantly, the counterculture of the Vietnam era also brought a deluge of drugs. Doing them and dealing them turned into an outlaw way of life.
The bikers were the very first to understand that they could make a lot of money selling drugs. They got into it right away. They bought out the chemists. They set up professional labs.
Drug trafficking and distribution would develop into many outlaws' main source of income. Prostitution was not far behind. Of the big 1% gangs, the Outlaws are the most likely to pimp their women. And for the past several decades, women have fallen prey to countless abuses at their hands.
The Outlaws consider women an object to be used to make money. I mean, she might be the guy's girlfriend, she might be his wife, but he's making her do 10, 20, 30 guys a night because it provides income for him.
The old ladies make the money that is in turn spent on dope, which is turned back into more money. If you took away all the old ladies, they'd be in trouble because I don't think one of them knows how to work.
Many young girls were not turning tricks by choice. They were prisoners who'd been kidnapped by the Outlaws.
They will abduct and they will rape them and teach them how to be prostitutes and put them out to work because the Outlaws are notoriously powerful in the white slave trade.
There's a lot of young girls who die, and the ones that don't die are burned out. When you're no good anymore.
As the Outlaws' illicit businesses grew, so did the club's increasing desire to protect the turf they deemed their own. Traditionally, the major 1% clubs, including the Outlaws and the Hells Angels, each had rigid and defined geographic regions. For the most part, they respected each other's space.
They realized that, okay, the Hells Angels will have West Coast, the Outlaws will have Middle America and Florida, and we're largely at peace. And they have a whole etiquette that goes with the territory.
But by the 70s, a lust for power and money was tempting the clubs beyond their time-honored borders and into enemy territory.
When these guys got into drugs and became heavy-duty criminals and businessmen in the underworld, they looked at each other differently. They looked at each other as competitors.
The war between the Outlaws and the Hells Angels unofficially began in 1974 when three Angels traveled to Florida. There, they encountered members of the Outlaws Fort Lauderdale chapter who had just learned that another outlaw had been beaten by an Angel. The Outlaws feigned nice and invited the Angels to their clubhouse for a beer.
And at one point, one of the Outlaws got up and said, "You know what? We don't drink beer with bastards like you." And they pulled out their guns, and they loaded them up into a van. They tied their hands and feet with pink clothesline, and they drove them out to a rock pit. And they put the shotguns to the back of their heads, and they blew their brains out over the rock pit.
Between 1974 and 1984, the Outlaws were implicated in 80 deaths in the state of Florida alone, leaving a trail of blood behind them. Outlaws spread into new states, North Carolina and Georgia, Michigan and Oklahoma. In 1977, the Outlaws expanded their enterprises north of the border, beating the Hells Angels into Canada. There, the Outlaws grabbed a foothold on the Canadian drug market, manufacturing and trafficking Valium and methamphetamines. But the Hells Angels were hot on their hogs, and Canadian soil became a battleground.
All of a sudden, people are using anti-tank rockets, they're using grenades, they're using RPGs, they're using, some people had flamethrowers.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, hundreds died in the Canada Biker Wars. The Canadian conflict was a harbinger of future strife to come.
And they just said, showtime. And they grabbed whoever was available, started cutting them with knives, firing their guns.
1994. A 30-year rivalry between the Outlaws Motorcycle Club and their enemies, the Hells Angels, had exploded into a vicious turf war across the Midwest. The Outlaws were doing whatever it took to protect their territory, and that meant taking on the Angels anytime, anywhere. At a public drag race near Buffalo, New York, nearly 50 outlaws descended on a smaller group of Angels. Armed with brass knuckles, axe handles, knives, and guns, the outlaws were looking for trouble.
And they just said, showtime. And they grabbed whoever was available, started cutting them with knives, firing their guns.
People were so terrified they were literally throwing their kids under cars so they wouldn't be hit by stray bullets.
By the end of the brawl, one Angel lay bleeding to death from knife wounds, and an outlaw lay shot and lifeless in the pit. At least 4 other gang members were injured.
This was just a sheer act of macho idiot terror.
That terror would continue. Days later, Outlaws International President Taco Bowman learned that a member of another motorcycle club had hugged a Hells Angel at the funeral of their fallen comrade. Outraged, Bowman ordered the Orlando, Florida chapter to retaliate.
Outlaws were told by Bowman, you're going to wipe them out, and they proceeded to beat the people to a pulp. That's Bowman. That's a consequence of somebody hugging a member of the Hells Angels 2,000 miles away.
That kind of brutality belies the public image that the Outlaws work hard to portray. That they are simply rebels who refuse to conform. They argue that though they may not live by the rules of society, the club does live by society's laws, and outlaws past and present insist that they are not a gang.
It's clear as day, MC means motorcycle club. It's on your back, motorcycle club. So MC, but it's not a gang, it's a club.
But according to the government, the American Outlaws Association is a 1,500-member criminal corporation with members as far-flung as Eastern Europe and Australia. While each of the club's nearly 200 chapters operates independently in its own territory, all answer to regional and national leaders who control the drug trade and the flow of money throughout the organization.
They are organized crime. They have a structure involved. They have a president, a vice president. You have to answer up through a chain of command. You've got foot soldiers.
Each chapter itself has a strict structure and hierarchy.
They keep a pretty tight rein on their membership, making sure that they don't get people that they would deem as undesirable.
Suspicious of everyone, the Outlaws put prospective members through a long and complex test period. It's a trial undercover agent Fingers experienced firsthand when he investigated the Outlaws Joliet, Illinois chapter.
You're basically the slave of the club at that point in time. You're going to do bar detail. You're going to clean up after the parties. You're going to stand security and watch bikes outside during the parties. And of course, you're going to be a constant lookout.
To be eligible, a prospect must be white, male, and own an American-made motorcycle with a minimum engine power of 1,000 cc's. The ultimate goal of a prospect, the privilege to wear every outlaw's most prized possession, their colors.
You earn those colors and you love those colors. You shouldn't lose your colors. This is one thing you don't want to do is lose your colors.
The Outlaws patch depicts the club insignia, the infamous skull and pistons.
It's kind of a takeoff of the Jolly Roger of the Pirates flag, where you have a skull and crossbones, but instead of the skull and crossbones, you've got a skull and crossed pistons.
Only full members are allowed to don the patch, not prospects, and certainly not women. Women have little stature in the Outlaws world, and the clubhouses are known as breeding grounds for misogyny and abuse.
They would hire strippers / prostitutes to come in. I think once you're in that environment and the door locks behind you and you got 30 or 40 outlaws in there, they're going to have their way.
Women are expendable. They don't look at them as anything other than property, so they don't really worry about how they're treated.
Wives and girlfriends of members called old ladies wear their own patch, property of the Outlaws.
It's no different than a car or a motorcycle. They own you. And in some cases, the gang owns the female, which is even a worse situation.
But some old ladies defend the patch and say its true meaning is misunderstood.
As stating a member says, hey, this is my old lady, and he's proud of her and wants the world to know that. You're not degraded in any way. You're not passed around between members. You know, it's the highest level of respect, truly.
Not all old ladies are so lucky. Many have been beaten for infractions such as poor housekeeping, disrespecting the club, and moving a member's vest without permission. Few ever report such crimes. For patched members, wearing the outlaw colors mandates complete loyalty to the club over all else.
One of the rules within the Outlaws is your brother may not always be right, but he will always be your brother. So no matter if he's out doing something wrong or bad or criminal or stupid, you have to support him in whatever endeavor it is that he's trying to accomplish.
Failure to do so can mean losing your colors, and sometimes worse. That's a lesson ex-outlaw Ani learned when he was forced to choose between the club brotherhood and his own blood. He defended his eldest son, a chapter vice president, in a fistfight against a higher-up. That was considered unforgivable.
I was thrown out of the Outlaws for a reason of protecting my son, you know. But he got jumped on by our higher captain or president. Basically, f this guy. You know, brothers don't jump on brothers. And that's when my heart was broken. My kid's heart was broken.
Ani managed to keep his colors and tattoos, a privilege not often granted to those kicked out of the club. According to the Outlaw Constitution, a member can get a club tattoo 1 year after receiving his patch. Most commonly inked are the Outlaw logos and slogans. OFFO, Outlaws Forever, Forever Outlaws. And GFOD, God forgives, outlaws don't. Some are more specific, like the SS symbol of the Nazi death squad.
The Outlaws, in particular, like some of these insignia, and they were worn as tattoos or as emblems on their vests by people who killed for the organization.
Nazi symbols, intended to intimidate and disturb civilians, became a club fixture for nearly 50 years. Even their club shoulder patch featured a prominent swastika. But as outlaws were arrested and began to go to trial, they learned that wearing such outrageous insignia came with an unexpected price.
A swastika on your vest. What are the outlaws going to say? What legitimate excuse are they going to come up with for it being on their vest? So at one point, they were told to take them off.
In 2000, the swastika on the club patch was quietly removed. But the Outlaws continue to brand themselves with their distinct club tattoos for identification and intimidation.
I think most of them will tell you it's better to be feared than respected. It was explained to me, if we sense any fear, we will act like a pack of piranhas.
These guys have a gangster thug mentality, and they display that through their body art. You know, something common you'll see with the Outlaws. Snitches are a dying breed. They'll